The premier female American portraitist is Sarah Miriam Peale. And she's from a very interesting family. As you can see, she lived to be 85 years old, and she became the leading portraitist in Baltimore and in St. Louis. Now, when I say the leading portraitist, I don't mean the leading female portraitist. I mean she sold more portraits than the male artists. So this is where she made her niche, as it were, and had an extremely successful career. We have several self-portraits of her. I was able to find pictures of two of them. This one from the Maryland Historical Society. First, I want to tell you about her, how this happened. She comes from a very remarkable family, sometimes called like the first family of American painters. This is the Peale family, the famous Peales. Her uncle, who was the leading artist of the whole family, was Charles Wilson Peale. He was a painter, and he was very interested in natural history. He indeed founded the first museum in America. And we see here one of his pictures of himself and his museum. One of the things that was particularly important in this museum, which I believe is still in Philadelphia, he's from Philadelphia. You can see at the very lower right, there is a jaw with teeth of a mastodon. Now, they called it a mammoth. They hadn't made that distinction yet. But Thomas Jefferson was very interested in this. Peale was very interested in this discovery. And so it was both a natural history and an art museum. One of the other things he did that was highly unusual was he championed the equality of the sexes. So what a wonderful family to grow up in if you're going to end up, how else would you become a successful woman artist? Her uncle, Charles Peale, also did something which is absolutely delightful. He had, I think it was 10 children, or maybe even more. He named 8 of them after painters. So the boys were Raphael, Rembrandt, Rubens, and Titian. The girls' names included Angelica Kaufman Peale, Sophonisba Aguisola Peale. That's a slight variation in her name. You sometimes see some variations in the spelling of the name. And Rosa Alba Carrera Peale, who very sadly died as a very small child, probably about 2 years old. And Sibela Miriam Peale, rather than Miriam Sibela, she's Sibela Miriam. So he seems to have been quite knowledgeable about the women artists of the past. Certainly much more so than any of my art history texts were when I was in school. His brother was James Peale, and this was Sarah's father. James Peale was primarily a miniaturist, but he also branched out and started doing portraits, landscapes, still lifes. And one of the things he did is he gave all his children art lessons, including the girls. And I found on the web this picture a little more ambitious than maybe his usual still lifes and miniature pictures of the artist and his family, but this is from a much earlier date than when Sarah was born. And this is a young self-portrait. She'd be 18 years old. This is Sarah Miriam Peale with her youthful self-portrait. She was trained by her father. Her uncle probably had some contributions to that, and also her cousin, Rembrandt Peale. And in her early work, we really do see the influence of Rembrandt Peale. He lived in Baltimore, so she would go down and visit him, I think in 1817, 1818, 1822. She'd go down for some months and visit him, and in the process probably received training from him. So she lived in Philadelphia at the beginning of her life, and as we'll see, at the very last 7 years of her life. But when she was in her early 20s, she moved to Baltimore, where she spent about 25 years. And then and I will tell you that I looked for dates on the web, and I looked for dates in books, and they do vary a bit. So around 1846 or 47, and they do vary a bit. Around 1846, she was having some health problems, and it was recommended that she move out west to St. Louis. And she spent about 30 years, I've seen one place said 30 years, another place said 32 years, but she spent some years in St. Louis before she then, in the last years of her life, returned to Philadelphia. She never married. And this is one of the things that I guess all professional women have to deal with. I know when I was growing up, there was an idea that, if you were going to have a career, you shouldn't get married. And women of my generation felt torn that way. They wanted to have the rights that the men did of being allowed to have both a family and a career. But it often was extremely difficult. People would fire you if you got pregnant. They didn't want to hire married women or women with children. So being married was a detriment to a career, even in the 1960s and 70s and 80s. Can you imagine what it would be in the 19th century? And we do see some women artists get married, and some women artists make the choice not to. Now, one of the interesting things that I found was a quotation from her uncle about her refusing to be married. Her uncle said that she broke all the beaux' hearts, but as usual would have none of them, and she remained single by choice. So as you can see, she's a very pretty young lady from a prominent, well-known family, but she decided not to get married and to devote herself to art, but also that she was going to have a professional career. One of the places that she exhibited was the Pennsylvania Academy of Art in Philadelphia. And the Pennsylvania Academy of Art seems to have been very important for women artists. Obviously, it was primarily male artists, but they did have training for women. They did let women exhibit, and as you can see, they did let some women become members. So she exhibited for the first time a flower still life in 1817. In 1818, she exhibited a full-size portrait. Now, I haven't been able to find the statement of who the portrait was. So I am wondering if it couldn't be this self-portrait. I'm not certain, but it's the right date, and certainly it's a possibility. By 1824, Sarah and her sister Anne were elected as members to the Pennsylvania Academy of Art. So they were starting to be recognized as accomplished and professional painters, in a sense. Anne particularly did still lifes, and I'm not sure, but I suspect that when she got married, she probably didn't do as much, and then possibly after her husband's death may have taken it up again. But it is Sarah, of course, who really does have the career as a painter. Now, this is another example where I was taking pictures in a museum, and the color just is not terribly wonderful. So I have these little tiny pictures from the museum's website, but if you blow them up, they will sort of start to disintegrate because they do not have very many pixels in them. But it gives you an idea of the presence, and then we'll see other pictures by Sarah Miriam Peale. These are fairly early in her career, Susanna and Isaac Avery. Just about the time, she's probably still in Philadelphia at this time. And you're seeing a paired portrait. We call these pendants when you have pictures that go together. This is a husband and wife. And they're probably wedding portraits, because that would be a good occasion on which to have yourself portrayed. The pose is very formal. They're both seated in a chair. They're very upright. They're dressed according to their social status. In other words, they have some wealth. The pose then is considered to be somewhat of a neoclassical pose, probably deriving ultimately from portraits by Jacques-Louis David. Rembrandt Peale favored this very formal, hard-edged, smooth surfaces, and so this directly shows the influence of Rembrandt Peale on his cousin Sarah. Now, one of the things that Sarah was known for, both her glazing techniques and also for painting details. And it's believed that she actually did help her father, when she was still in his household, and may have painted some of the details of things like shawls and other clothing items. And one of my details did come out, as you can see. There's a detail of the cashmere shawl and the hands and the patterning on the shawl, and a little bit of lace, transparent lace at her cuff. But there's some very nice details in this which are not showing up too well. Portrait of the faces, obviously, careful likenesses. This from about the same time is another portrait of a young woman, Anna Marie Smythe or Smith. And I don't know who she was, but there she is, seated in a traditional pose, but it's a pose that gives you some action. She's turned around, her hand is resting on the back of the settee, and she's made she's made the most of this young lady's evidently elegant physique, because she has a kind of long face and a long neck, and that comes across as very graceful. I also was able to blow up this detail of the lace collar, little dots on it, a little transparent collar, so you can see once again that idea of painting the details, and probably the feathered fan also would be another example. I don't have a detail of that. Probably another year later, another portrait. You'll see these are all very smoothed over. The earlier ones, some of the earlier ones, such as the Averys, the head looked a little large for the body, but she seems to be correcting that. And there's certainly a feeling of negative and positive spaces, little variety in the way the pose is. Here she's given Mrs. Charles Ridgely Carroll, whose maiden name was Rebecca Ann Pugh. She's given her a kind of contemplative, thoughtful pose. The idea of resting your hand on your cheek, resting your cheek on your hand, certainly goes back to Renaissance and probably even classical times as an idea of thinking or contemplating. There's a lot of interest here in the texture and pattern and color of the wrap, which seems to be a fur wrap lined with color, and there's lots of little touches of the color here. Her portrait skills are improving. This is another portrait of a well-to-do businessman and his wife. It's another pendant portraits of husband and wife. In this case, the Courtlands. And you'll notice that she's trying to give you a sense of their character. It's almost like she's starting now to move a little bit away from the very, very formal poses that you would have learned earlier. And they're becoming more people. There's a smile on the wife's face, patient Cole Courtman. And you do get a sense, I know when I looked at this, I said, oh, what a charming lady. You do get a feeling that she's somewhat approachable. And her husband, there's just a slight smile. He's obviously a prominent businessman. He's dignified, and yet there's a little bit of approachability about this. And I wonder if this could also be called American character. That you don't always have to be an elitist. That even wealthy people showing their wealth with their portraiture can be approachable in a sense. Another prominent person here, Fielding Lucas Jr., who is a founder of the Maryland Institute College of Art. That wasn't what they originally called it. It was the promotion of mechanical arts when he was one of the founders. So a person with some interest in the arts, and he's having Sarah Miriam Peale paint him. And as you can see, the modeling of the face has become much stronger here. That kind of flatness is really not part of this portrait. Much solid. She seems to sometimes go back and forth between that. This is one of her very famous portraits because it's of a famous man, the Senator Thomas Hart Benton. Now, he was not the artist Thomas Hart Benton. He was the great uncle of the artist. But he was a very prominent person in his day. He was a senator from Missouri. He was the first 5-term senator. So at that time, he'd been a senator longer than anybody else. Coming from Missouri, which was on the frontier at the time, you can imagine he did favor westward expansion. And one of the things that I found when I was looking him up on the web was that although he was a slave owner, he changed his mind. And he lost his Senate seat because he said that he was against slavery. Now, I was very curious. It did not say whether he enfranchised, it did not say whether he freed his slaves or not, and I would really like to know that about him. But I do have respect for people who, when they see that they have been in error and a tremendous moral and ethical error, that they're big enough to okay, let's go back. I was looking on the web for information about him, and I found that he was a slave owner, but he lost his Senate seat when he declared himself against slavery. Now, the website did not say whether he freed his own slaves. I'd be very interested to know that. But that's a very interesting stance because so often, particularly politicians, but many people, when you have a view, they cling to it. And here, when he evidently was proved morally wrong, he changed his attitude. And at some penalty to himself that he lost his Senate seat. He was, I think, a one-term congressman later and ran for governor, which was not successful. But he's certainly one of the most famous politicians of the 19th century. Well, let's take a look at his portrait, and I also was able to find a photograph of him because there are photographs. The photograph, of course, is somewhat scratched, but there are several on the web, and this one was in pretty much the same pose but reversed. The photo there was no date on it. Guessing from the amount of hair that he has, I assume the photograph is slightly later. But you can see then that Sarah Miriam Peale's portrait is a good likeness, captures the shape of his nose, the shape of his face, the shape of his eyes, and yet it makes him so much more, once again, approachable. There's a slight smile. It looks like somebody you could come to with your problems about it. And there's a variegated background, which blends into the light, which makes a nice contrast to his dark suit. It's basically a little more than a bust portrait. comes down to a little above his waist, but doesn't show the hands or anything like this. So it's a very formal portrait pose, and yet there's a bit of informality in the wisps of the locks and the way he smiles. I also found these. I did not find any date to the Hall Harrison portrait, and once again the color is off on this. It's too red. Henry Wise, I did find a date on that, 1842. At least from the reproductions of these, and I have not seen them, they do appear to be the smoother portraits that she had in the style that she had done earlier. So it may be that she can adjust her style to the sitter and to what's expected of her. One of the unfortunate things was I really wanted to find some portraits from her St. Louis period, and I have not been able to find reproductions of those so far. It is said that her style became much freer as in her later period. I thought this was interesting. I took this off the web, and it's possible that the painting is in bad condition because I did hype the color and the contrast a bit so it would be clearer. But this is a portrait of an ambassador. I think it's probably the ambassador from Brazil. It's still owned by the Brazilian embassy. And so it shows you the kind of people that she was portraying. Wealthy, upper middle class people, politicians, statesmen, people who are very prominent, even ambassadors. Occasionally, she would paint something that was not essentially a portrait. I mean, I don't know whether she had a sitter for this or not. This was called the Veil of Mystery, or the Veiled Woman, and it's possibly not a specific portrait, but just something to show that she can do something that suggests a narrative, a story. You know, why is this woman veiled? She looks very exotic. She has lace and flowers, and she's also showing her skill, and I think that's probably one of the reasons she did this, to be able to show a transparent veil. How do you do that in paint? Well, obviously one of the ways you do it is have transparent washes of very light whites and grays and the light colors of the veil as the folds to suggest that this veil covers the face. But I think she's trying to show her skill here, and just a little variety. It was interesting to me when I found these two pictures in different places, because I thought that the woman, Mrs. William Crane, her maiden name was Jean Nevin Daniel, did resemble the veiled woman. I'm not going to go so far as to say that it's a portrait because I don't know that, but I thought that was kind of interesting. Maybe just the idealization of the form, but they both seem to have the same sort of high cheekbones and oval shape of the face. I brought this in particularly because there was a detail of the shawl, and so you can see some of that detail that she's very famous for, and the light is picking up the brocade or the embroidery threads. She also did portraits of children. In this case, it's a posthumous portrait. In other words, the child had died, and the parents wanted a portrait to remember their child by. And what she's done here, it does not show a formal pose, but to show the child as actually doing little cutouts in a childish pose that the child is playing, so that they can remember their daughter that way. She painted still lifes, mostly at the two ends of her career, I said, mostly in the 1820s, early in her career, and then later on from about 1859 onward. Most of the pictures I could find on the web seem to be from the earlier period. I found one that was dated 1860, and some are undated. One of the interesting things about these, they're fairly simple in their layout, but she's trying to show the texture of the fruit and the vessel that it's contained in. All of them are from pretty much the same point of view, at least of these earlier ones, where they're on a tabletop. You're looking pretty much straight at it. and a kind of very pleasing diagonal pose with an interesting positive and negative shapes. In other words, the background shape or the negative shape has been considered here. I thought this was interesting. She seems to have done a number of pictures of watermelons, which, you know, it really is an interesting way, because obviously the melon has been cut, perhaps some bites have been taken out of it, so you're getting all sorts of plays of shapes and textures with basically a very simple form. I thought quite intriguing. Here are some more of those fruit just on the tabletop or ledge, very simply painted. And this was the picture that I found from the later period. It's said that her later paintings were more loosely painted. And as I said, I'm having some difficulty finding pictures of this. This is the basket of berries from 1870, and you can see she's changed the whole pose. Instead of just being on a tabletop, it's sort of out in nature. The basket is tipped. You have this mound of the berries, which seem to have spilled out or never yet been put in the basket, probably spilled out, in nature with the green foliage around it. So it gives it a much more natural period. It gives it a much more natural, appearance. So it gives it a much more natural appearance. Sometimes showing the fruit on the ground, hanging from a branch, and out of doors. So the idea that the fruit is part of nature goes into this idea of natural forms, living fruit, essentially. Philadelphia Academy wasn't out in St. Louis, but she did enter her paintings in agricultural fairs, state fairs in St. Louis, and did win prizes there. Presumably she's one of the most accomplished artists in St. Louis at the time. Around 1878, she returned to Philadelphia, and she lived there until her death in 1885. Until they died, she lived with her sisters, Anne Claypool, who had been married, but had been widowed, and Margarita Angelica. Both of them had been painters. Margarita Angelica does little miniatures, probably in the type of things that her father had been doing, James had been doing. Anne is more known for her still life paintings. Neither of them are quite as prominent, of course, as Sarah, because she was really carving out a career as a single woman and as an American painter.